Honest Discussioner is HD's well-organized, calm, and candid response to my 7-part series on substance dualism. He argues therein that the more we study the brain, the more we realize that substance dualism does not fit into mental processes, and that the arguments that I proffered are generally either ignorant or ignore the majority of neuroscience. Moreover, even if the aforementioned evidence did not exist against substance dualism, the postulated soul would remain ad hoc, and with no evidence to support it. Now, HD attempts to demonstrate this major thesis via two counter-arguments, namely Occam's razor and brain damage. It should be noted by those who watched the entirety of the series that I did on substance dualism, that while HD mentions that he is focusing on one part of 7, he does not work within the arguments for dualism, nor does he discuss the problems of competing theories, nor does he develop the idea of Cartesian dualism, which I was supporting, which functions within a mind-brain correlation, and this is a very key point here. So with this mentioned, what I would like to do is discuss the topics that HD brings up in his video. Before I do that, I'd like to raise two quick side notes. First, I have made some remarks in the description about several side notes that HD brings up that I just don't have the time to mention, so they're in the description. Second, I can only conclude that HD did not watch the entirety of my argument, as is evidenced by his statements about substance dualism being ad hoc and not evidenced. Now, while understandable due to its length, at the risk of sounding snide, this is also unfortunate, not to mention misleading, as I detailed several arguments, both direct and indirect, to establish substance dualism. For example, the indiscernibility of identicals, the enduring I, free will, etc. And the only reason why such a comment would be made would seem to be a rhetorical flourish. Substance dualism is not ad hoc, nor is it not evidenced, and I have provided said argument throughout this series, and I wish they would have been at least mentioned. Now, with these two asides in place, I'd first like to look at HD's discussion of Occam's razor and vicariously intentionality and first-person subjective experience, or the knowledge argument, and then look at brain damage. So first, HD states at a minute 45, quote, telemantros argues that physicalism cannot account for both intentionality and first-person subjective experiences, and therefore Occam's razor does not apply, end quote. Here, HD captures part of what I argued against, namely that there are mental phenomena that physicalism cannot account for, but he leaves out the subsequent argument that while rival theories differ radically about the application of certain epistemic values, for example, fruitfulness of new research, accurate predictiveness, etc., it may be inappropriate for advocates of a theory to cite its superior component within an epistemic value when another theory does not weigh that value as heavily as they do a different one they take to be more central to that theory. In other words, given the epistemic values of simplicity and descriptive accurateness, it is inappropriate and question-begging for advocates of one theory, let's say physicalism, to weight said value over another very equally important value, descriptive accurateness. Moreover, as Veritas 48 has mentioned before, Occam's razor is often misinterpreted in its application, and this applies to this discussion. Occam's razor states simply that entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. The key in that metaphysical principle is beyond necessity. It does not say that one must posit one entity, otherwise he is guilty of overcomplicating things. Rather, at the risk of repeating myself, if human personhood is more descriptively explained by two entities, mental and physical, then this is not multiplying entities beyond necessity, for human persons require two entities to be explained. Thus, in light of physicalism's inability to locate mental phenomena in its ontology, and the solid base of physicalists who hold to mental phenomena to be existent, example Searle, as well as the arguments I gave for substance dualism, it is safe to say that Occam's razor still does not apply. But for the sake of thoroughness, let me quickly respond to HD's use of two studies that attempt to account for intentionality and subjective experience. First, HD states that non-conscious programs can have a goal, and he appeals to a computer program that demonstrates adaptive behavior and a referent green box, which are alleged to demonstrate natural selection at work. However, as Lego Decia has argued previously and following Victor Reppert, quote, when we consider material entities that exhibit intentionality, we see that they do not have their intentional content inherently, but have it relative to human interests, for example, marks on a page. In other words, it possesses a derived intentionality as opposed to original intentionality. Now, HD attempts to ground this by appealing to a biological role or function as what determines physical intentionality, a vis-a-vis the computer simulation. However, as atheistic philosopher John Searle rightly argues, and I quote at length here, quote, "A symptom that something is radically wrong with the project is that intentional notions are inherently normative. They set standards of truth, rationality, consistency, etc., and there's no way that these standards can be intrinsic to a system consisting entirely of brute, blind, non-intentional causal relations. Darwinian biological attempts at naturalizing content try to avoid this problem by appealing to what they suppose is the inherent teleological or purposefully normative character of biological evolution. But this is a very deep mistake. There is nothing normative or teleological about Darwinian evolution. Indeed, Darwin's major contribution was precisely to remove purpose and teleology from evolution and substitute it for purely natural forms of selection." End quote. So very crudely put, the framework that gives the meaning to actions made by the computer is supplied by the human observer, not by the biological function that is alleged to be simulated by the computer program, and moreover, evolution cannot have purpose. Second, HD argues against first-person subjective experience by appealing to a study using fMRI and states that subjective experience is merely a translation of information. He states, quote, "The best they can do to explain why certain areas of the brain light up during certain tasks is that the interaction between the physical brain and the immaterial mind is immediate, and the mind, or soul, is causing the brain cells that cause decisions to fire. If the brain is unconsciously affecting the conscious mind seconds in advance, this contradicts the dualist theory of mental phenomena." End quote. It is here that I feel like HD did not watch the entirety of my argument in my series, as I have argued just the above, but have often repeated several times that correlation does not equal dependence. For example, looking at the fMRI results, 60% of the time the fMRI picked up brain states that correlated correctly with volitional choice would represent the mental states. However, this far from proves dependence, as we would need to see overt 1-to-1 ratios here of brain to mental to demonstrate dependence. But we do not see this. Rather, like other substance dualists and myself have been arguing, this simply illustrates the correlation between mental and physical states. If I worry in my soul, my brain chemistry will change. If I will in my soul to raise my arm, then my arm goes up. If I experience brain damage, this can cause me to lose the ability to remember certain things in my soul, and so forth. Thus, the observer can only guess at what one is thinking. Concisely, correlations does not prove dependence, and this is in no way a contradiction between dualistic theories of mental phenomena, as HD suggests. So succinctly, Occam's razor does not apply here because 1. Physicalism cannot account for certain mental states again. 2. Placing methodological constraints on certain epistemic values is question-begging if one theory better explains a phenomena. And 3. HD appeals to a somewhat misinterpreted use of Occam's razor. Now all this segues nicely to HD's second objection against substance dualism, namely brain damage and effects on the mind. He says, quote, "If substance dualism is correct and thoughts are caused by this immaterial substance, disrupting the brain would not necessarily disrupt our thoughts, but only their expression. But observations of split brain, when you sever the corpus callosum, split brain persons would seem to disconfirm this," end quote. But again, since brain and mental states are correlated, it would make perfect sense that damage in one could result in damage in another. This is not a problem. But as I previously hypothesized, it could be the case that the mind remains intact while the mechanism which manifests it is damaged, to wit, HD appeals to split brain cases. However, far from detailing an objection against my argument, HD's use of severed neural pathways and the subsequent inadequate communication between the brain states does not count against substance dualism. HD states that if the mind existed, it could inform both sides and tell them what they see. So why couldn't the mind serve as the corpus callosum? But not necessarily, HD. Obviously there is a severance between the communication between the lobes, but it is not necessarily the job of the soul to communicate between the hemispheres of the brain. After all, that's why the physical corpus callosum was there in the first place. So what HD is doing is faulting the mind for a job it might not even have. Thus, at most, the objections raised against substance dualism provide evidence for correlation between mind and brain states, to wit, I agree wholly. It does not nullify substance dualism, nor does it pawn the series that I made when it simply dialogues with one section at the expense of other sections that establish further clarification and argumentation for the position itself. That said, I think HD did a very good job with the organization and content, even if I don't agree with his conclusions and interpretations of that content. Thank you very much for your thoughts, HD. Peace.